Hey everyone, my name is Angela Ramirez. I am the journalist and writer here at the No Man Zone. Today we are going to be doing a video on the latest blog that hit the site, and it is called Open Source Politics, Shell 501c3s, and George Soros, the Domestic Terror Landscape in America. That sounds like a really ominous title, but I think that if you guys are going to dive into it with me, you will find it very interesting. So like everything on this YouTube channel or this wherever you're finding this video, it might be on band.video. Wherever you're watching this, just know that you can go to the manzone.com and you can find all of these blogs in full with all of the journalistic sources for you to review there on my site. So with that said, we're going to dig into the latest blog, go over all of the information that is included in it, and also talk about the sources. And as we go through, I'll try and keep it as much of a journalistic video as possible without giving too much of my input, of my personal input. I'd kind of like to just give you guys the facts and leave you to make the decisions. I think that as much as I would like to share my opinion, our world is really lacking on quality journalism today. So my goal with all of these videos is to present you the facts and have you kind of go about making your own decisions on what is like how these journalistic stories play into the national and global landscape. So with that said, let us get into it. Open source politics, Shell 501c3s, and George Soros, the domestic terror landscape in America. All right. First things first, it's really important to understand how big of a role the internet has played in not just management and business, but also in the way people collect and act on ideas. So open source software is something that I've been familiar with for a while because I spend so much time on the internet. It is essentially a form of management that allows people to collaborate with one another on a certain project without ever designating one person or group as like the authority figure on the, like, I guess, the project. So with that said, I had been familiar with open source software for a while, and when I saw the political landscape changing in the United States, I was very much reminded of open source software. And so I was like, this is kind of like open source politics because no one group really has the authority, like specifically I'm talking about in regards to Black Lives Matter, Global Network, and Movement for Black Lives, which is like a subsidiary of Black Lives Matter, even though Black Lives Matter says that's not true. It on Movement for Black Lives donation page, they actually have Black Lives Matter listed as a donor or as a recipient of funds that they receive. And all of that we're going to get into later. But as I was looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and the way the Democratic Party was involved in a lot of these events, we'll call them, they were very much endorsed by leaders of the Democrat Party. I saw that and I was like, this is so interesting because there's no one person who has a leadership role in this movement. Like we have the Black Lives Matter Global Network who like coined the hashtag and has been heavily involved in organizing events and providing support to the events. But to this day, they still deny any sort of leadership role, right? So in that instance, I was like, this is very much like open source software. So it inspired me to write a piece about open source politics. And at the time of myself writing it, I hadn't done very much research into the idea or theory of open source politics. It was very much a hypothesis that I was acting on. And then once I came to start doing some research, it transformed from a hypothesis to more of a theory. And so here we have it in the first section of this blog. The first section is called Open Source Political Theory, a Liability Shield for Treason and Domestic Terror. I'll read this section of the blog and then I'll elaborate for you guys. So it says, open source politics is not a new theory. There are products and services available worldwide to serve people looking to create or expand an open source political movement. As we expand these theories, parties have actually published online to bring that theory into fruition. The development of open source political theory is a subset of this section, so I'm going to elaborate there. So the next section says the development of open source political theory. According to opensource.com, a publication written by Eric S. Raymond called Cathedral and the Bizarre, Musings of Linux and Open Source by an Accidental Revolutionary was published and gave birth to essentially what the concept is of using open source as a political governing system as opposed to just a software management platform, right? This publication influenced computer programmers named with, I'm sure, what are pseudonyms, Are You Serious and Trevor Tromish to develop what is now called the Open Source Party. Upon reviewing the movement created by Black Lives Matter Global Network, it's safe to say that their organizational structure reflects open source political theory. This open source nature explains why various Marxist groups, such as the Maoist Communist Party and the Black Lives Matter movement, have used Black Lives Matter as sort of an umbrella for all of their Marxist agendas. So, to elaborate on that section just really quickly, I have sources for pretty much everything that is stated there because I wanted to do a really good job documenting where I'm getting this information from, because in my opinion, that's the difference between a conspiracy theory and real journalism and truth, is that the conspiracy theories, like I think conspiracy theorists, at least today, are more often than not working off of real facts that have not been communicated to the public properly, and therefore the public can't make a decision because they haven't seen that information. And so specifically with a topic like this, especially involving George Soros, which is a super controversial name in of itself, everybody seems to have an opinion on who George Soros is without ever actually looking into the guy. So I wanted to make sure that I would accurately cite my sources, which I've done. So here, when I explain that open source politics has been a theory that was developed, I give you guys sources to the publication that was written by Eric S. Raymond, The Cathedral and the Bizarre. I give references to the writings of Are You Serious and Trevor Tromish for their open source party theory and the development of an open source party. Something that I didn't include in this blog because I didn't want to get too far off the beaten path of what the topic was, but I found extremely unsettling, was the fact that when I found the writings of Are You Serious and Trevor Tromish, you're not even going to believe this, I literally laughed when I saw it because I almost couldn't believe it. I was like, I'm shocked that I'm actually reading this right now, right? It was like one of those feelings, it was like super surreal. So where I found the writings of Tromish and Are You Serious was in a magazine called H Plus Magazine. And H Plus Magazine is actually Humanity Plus. What is Humanity Plus? It is a magazine essentially designed to discuss transhumanism, which sounds insane in of itself. But that's what they talk about in the magazine is transhumanism, cloning. It's essentially humanity plus whatever it is you choose to add in to humanity. Very interesting stuff there. So I thought that was interesting and concerning that when I did find information on open source political theory, that it was in a magazine dedicated to transhumanism. Again, I haven't included that necessarily. I haven't included an explanation on that magazine in the blog because I wanted very much to maintain the integrity of the journalism and focus on just the one specific topic that was relevant to the point that I was trying to illustrate. I will definitely be writing on transhumanism in the future because I think it's something that I personally would like to look into and learn more about, but also I feel is a topic that needs to be explored by a journalist and have the facts laid out for people to review so that they can follow the logic of going from transhumanism isn't real to, oh wow, transhumanism is actually being written about and probably practiced in some regard. So that is coming, but for now we're not going to talk about that. And I'm sorry that I've gone off on a tangent about it. But I thought it would be interesting for those of you listening to the video to understand where this information has come from. Anyway, back to the blog. The next section is called Diffusion of Legal Liability in Domestic Terror Activities. And to read an excerpt of this section, it goes as follows. Because open source by nature is built around the concept of a leaderless collaboration, it can be conveniently used as a liability shield for domestic terror activities. By flooding political movements with masses of low-producing contributors, power-seeking political organizers are able to diffuse legal responsibility while enjoying the benefit of having a truly uninformed army of contributors to execute daily tasks according to the political plot. By flooding, the word contributors here is used to describe individuals and groups with similar but more moderate goals and beliefs. They want to make a positive difference in the world, have little interest in political power, and are uneducated on the identifying features of communism or are in favor of them. Sounds exactly like what we see here in Black Lives Matter and the surrounding anarchist Marxist movements. To read the next section, it's called Relief of Legal Accountability and Movement of Leadership. This organizational design relieves the burden of legal accountability from the true puppeteers of the movement, such as political power players, financiers, and domestic and foreign terrorists. Next section. The George Floyd Rebellion open source umbrella. This is super important. In my research, what I have discovered is that the George Floyd movement has been referred to by Marxist groups not as the George Floyd riots or the George Floyd uprising or the George Floyd protests. It has been called the George Floyd Rebellion. And when I say open source umbrella here, what I mean is I'm using umbrella as a coverall for people who are included in this open source agenda. People who are included in this open source movement, right? So it's an open source movement with an umbrella of causes that people can kind of rally around and push for the same political goals, I guess, without being of the same exact mindset. So that said, let's get into the topic of the George Floyd Rebellion and an open source umbrella. We have seen this open source political theory play out right before our eyes during the national BLM-led George Floyd Rebellion. Peaceful protests were used as a shield for domestic terror activities, such as attacking federal buildings, police precincts, and toppling publicly owned statues. Millions of citizens truly concerned about racism, police brutality, and obtaining due process for the families of victims killed by police took to the streets. These mass protests were directly influenced by the Black Lives Matter global networks, carefully crafted, purportedly grassroots social media channels, which used social platforms as propaganda distribution channels to encourage the mobilization of millions of big-hearted, useful idiots. Meanwhile, radicals associated with Antifa, who have been well documented to operate within the BLM open source movement, utilize these political protests to pursue their own violent agendas in an attempt to topple national values of the Democratic Republic of the United States of America. Right, that's a lot to chew on. There's two sources in there. The first one is referring to the BLM rebellion. And the attacking of federally owned statues and police precincts that I have linked a YouTube video for. The next one is talking about, the next source I cite is about the radicals that are associated with Antifa. And the source that I have cited there is from the Post Millennial, in which they have a video and explanation of Andy Ngo's testimony to Congress, in which he discusses what has happened and what he's seen from covering Antifa for so long. So I think that those sources are probably good for you guys to go back and review, because I do think that that's really important to understand what is happening that the media isn't really covering. Anyway, and back into the blog, I would like to talk about the seemingly diffused leadership of open source political movements. So as I mentioned earlier, the open source political theory is based on the idea that no one person has responsibility for the movement, and thus no one person takes responsibility for any sort of bad practices, violence, domestic terror, insurrection activities. It's hard to pin down one person when you have no obvious signs of leadership, right? So from what I've researched, it would seem that that would be a contributing factor to choosing open source political theory as your go-to method of executing the Black Lives Matter framework of ideas, right? So seemingly diffused leadership and legal responsibility is the name of this next section. And why is it seemingly diffused responsibility? Because despite the fact that open source politics is designed to distribute responsibility, the Pareto Principle insists that it is universally true that roughly 80% of results come from 20% of causal effects. So that would imply that despite political theory operating on a open source agenda, even though we have, let's say, 100 people, let's just dumb it down to 100 people for math's sakes, we have 100 people contributing to this agenda, and let's say, things are being done, policies are being changed, but when you actually look at the numbers, the Pareto Principle would agree and insist that 20% of the people in that 100, so 20 people, are actually the ones producing the causes that are resulting to the effects in policy change. So that said, I believe it would be safe to say that the Pareto Principle could be applied to open source political theory, and thus we would be able to determine who organizers are, group leaders are, primary content contributors, and financiers would probably be, from what I've seen, the top 20%, aside, from politicians and very, very large organizations who perhaps have a hand in what is at play. So I would say that the Pareto Principle kind of negates this idea that there is no legal responsibility involved in open source theory. I think that it would be safe to say that if we were to dig into who is really pushing forward this agenda versus who is kind of just taking the information and running with it because they feel like they're a social justice warrior, and they're taking up arms against the bad guys, I think that we would find that a very select few people would be actually moving this agenda forward. So that was a piece of the blog that pointed out that the Pareto Principle kind of disputes the fact that nobody has any real responsibility here. Now, with that said, let's get into financing. Who's funding all of this? That's the real question I wanted to know. Domestic terror is kind of expensive. Funding people to bus around the globe, I mean, not the globe, but, the nation is expensive. Housing people, pretty expensive. Something that I found particularly interesting was that at a Denver protest here in Colorado, where there have been protests now for roughly 50 days in a row, and Jared Polis has literally done and said nothing about it. Here in Colorado, I just so happened to be in the vicinity of a protest and filming, and overheard somebody say that half the group was going to go back to camp, and that this individual was going to go back to wherever it was that they lived. And I thought that was extremely interesting because I was like, what do you mean they're going to go back to camp? These are protesters in Denver. Do they not have somewhere that they live? Why are they all going back to a camp as opposed to going home? And the individual who was speaking then proceeded to say, well, I guess that's the night shift. That's the night shift. what do you mean that's the night shift? I would say that a shift is a word used traditionally to describe a work shift. And so I found that interesting. So I was just curious, where does the financing come from? Because if somebody, let's say, is taking shifts, a day shift and a night shift of protesting, I would imagine they're not doing it for free. I would imagine that the money is coming from somewhere. So I said to myself, let's look at the 501c3 fiscal sponsors that Black Lives Matter and their umbrella of networks are working with to not only collect donations and handle, the finance aspect of things, but in a lot of cases, what these guys are doing essentially is they're working with 501c3 organizations as a fiscal sponsor. So what they're doing is they have their company and then they say, well, we don't want to handle the finances of this company and we don't have whatever it is that's needed to get a 501c3 nonprofit status, which actually makes them tax exempt in most cases. So what they do is they say, we're going to get a fiscal sponsor, which means a company outside of their own already has 501c3 status, and they offer to run the books and admin for your company. So essentially, in the case of Black Lives Matter is their own little company, and they use a fiscal sponsor, which is a 501c3. Their fiscal sponsor is Thousand Currents, and Thousand Currents essentially handles the money for Black Lives Matter. Now, it could be argued that the purpose for doing something like this would be to free up the Black Lives Matter Global Network's time so that they can focus on their goals and what really matters, as opposed to handling finances and admin stuff and paperwork. It kind of detracts from the amount of time that you have to do good in the world, right? That would be an argument for using a fiscal sponsor. I would like to read you guys this excerpt from my blog and ask what you think and what your thoughts are on this utilization of fiscal sponsors. Here we go. In the same way, the legal risk in the illegal drug trade is bottlenecked largely on distributors, drug runners, and gangs. The open source political theory of diffused legal responsibility bottlenecks at the financing and funding level, where it is suspected by the writer that shell 501c3s are being utilized as a sophisticated, multi-tiered domestic terror funding hub, disguised as civil rights and philanthropic ventures. Okay. 1. Fiscal sponsors. When a fiscal sponsor is used, the hiring organization has no legal responsibility regarding the mistakes and compliance. Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation partnered with their fiscal sponsor, Thousand Currents, which affords Black Lives Matter Global Network which allows them to obtain all the benefits of a 501c3 nonprofit organization without holding legal liability in regards to the financial malpractice or misappropriation of funds. We see this play out in detail with the organization Movement for Black Lives, who has partnered with the Alliance for Global Justice as their fiscal sponsor. I've included 2 sources for you guys to review. If you guys would like to look at them, please do. Now, the Movement for Black Lives. I detail this whole scenario in full with IRS tax statements because it's almost too unbelievable, even for me actually going through the information to believe it. So here we go. I'm going to read it to you guys, and then I encourage you to go read it yourself. But after I read it here, I'll go ahead and elaborate for you. Movement for Black Lives, funded by George Soros, according to IRS tax statements. On paper, Movement for Black Lives is a different organization from the Black Lives Matter Global Network. However, Movement for Black Lives lists Black Lives Matter as a part of their movement on their donation checkout page, which is actually through ActBlue, which is the same donation page that they use, which Black Lives Matter uses as their checkout process. Section. Different fiscal sponsor, same donation collecting page. Although Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter are fiscally sponsored through different organizations, Movement for Black Lives lists Black Lives Matter as a part of their movement on their donation page via ActBlue. Black Lives Matter Global Network also uses ActBlue as their fundraising payment processor. While Black Lives Matter is fiscally sponsored through Thousand Currents, Movement for Black Lives is fiscally sponsored through the Alliance for Global Justice. Like Thousand Currents, Alliance for Global Justice is a radical left-wing fundraising group that regularly holds meetings between U.S. members and Venezuelan communist advocates. Movement for Black Lives mirrors the culture, speech patterns, and policy demands of the Black Lives Matter organization. The major difference is between the two groups that the Movement for Black Lives holds a more openly aggressive political view to what is written on the Black Lives Matter website. Movement for Black Lives was created in 2014, just 1 year after Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi coined the term Black Lives Matter and organized Black Lives Matter Global Network, just 1 year after. Now, here on the blog, what I have is a picture of the Alliance for Global Justice's tax statement. It's a 990 tax form. And just to remind you, the Alliance for Global Justice is the fiscal sponsor for Movement for Black Lives, which would appear to be something of a political arm for the Black Lives Matter movement. Movement for Black Lives really does mostly a lot of work with bills and politics. Like, they are a very political wing of what would seem to be a wing of the Black Lives Matter movement from what I've seen. They handle the formation of bills. They handle getting signatures, things like that. Right now they have a Breathe Act out, which I will be writing on shortly. But just so you guys understand who Movement for Black Lives is, they're like a political arm of Black Lives Matter. So anyway, here on the page, I have a printout of the tax statement 990 from Alliance for Global Justice. And what page it is, it's page 8 of whatever, I can't tell how many pages are on here. But it's page 8, and it has the contributors of who has contributed to the actual foundation. So who's contributed? I went through and I was just kind of glancing through the tax statements, trying to figure out who it was, and who it was that was donating regularly. And I found an organization had donated in 2016, 17, and 18, and their name is the NewWorld Foundation. That's what it is on the tax form here. It's number 43, line item number 43. They donated $100,000 in 2017. $100,000. In 2018, they donated $135K. So, on a tax statement, every time somebody contributes money, the organization's name is listed with the address. So, the reason the NewWorld Foundation stood out to me is not just because the name of the company is NewWorld Foundation, but also because their address is listed at 666 West End Avenue in New York, New York. I was like, that's kind of weird. So I went ahead and looked into it. And sure enough, the NewWorld Foundation is indeed located on West End Avenue according to their website. However, on their website, which is open for public view and is probably more regularly looked at by the public than their 990 contribution to Alliance for Global Justice, their site says that their address is listed at 680 West End Avenue in New York. So on their tax donation, it says that their address is 666 West End Avenue, but their address listed on their public website says that they're located at 680 West End Avenue. That's interesting. So I decided I would just go ahead and look into these guys. Who is the NewWorld Foundation? 666 West End Avenue. It's a little ominous and kind of conspiratorial to have that name and address together. I thought it was a little strange. So I dug in. Who are these guys, right? And then I get to this. It's a George Soros philanthropic 501c3 fiscally sponsored company, who also, interestingly enough, offers fiscal sponsorships. Interesting. So let's get into who these guys are. I'm going to read to you all of this next section of the blog, which is unbelievable unless you really go through and look at these sources that I've listed. I mean, I listed like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 sources in just 2 little short paragraphs. I don't even think there's 10 sentences in these 2 short paragraphs, but there's 6 sources. So this is really important information that has, tax records and ownership records attached to it to prove what is actually being brought to you on this video. So I encourage you to go actually read the No Man's Zone and look at this stuff. Here's an excerpt from this next section of the blog. Movement for Black Lives is financially supported by George Soros. 3 tiers of fiscal sponsors for moving funds. George Soros funds Movement for Black Lives. To trace the funding, you have to dive deep into the tax records and ownership records of what can only be described as a sophisticated 3-tiered philanthropy funding train that uses 501c3 sponsors to trickle funds from Soros to the Movement for Black Lives. Again, M4BL states on their donation page that funds are appropriated to the Black Lives Matter organization. So, Alliance for Global Justice receives funding for M4BL, Movement for Black Lives, through George Soros's funded NewWorld Foundation. According to the Alliance for Global Justice's IRS 990 forms from 2016 to 2019, one of their top yearly donors was the NewWorld Foundation, located, according to the IRS 990, at 660 West End Avenue, New York, New York. Interestingly enough, on their website, they list their address as 680 West End Avenue. Like Alliance for Global Justice, the NewWorld Foundation also offers services as a fiscal sponsor. The NewWorld Foundation states that they began grant-making initiatives in 2011 in collaboration with Open Society Foundations and Mott Philanthropic. George Soros is the founder of Open Source Society Foundations. Mott Philanthropic has a strange one-page website with vague information about their organization and no board of directors listed, and a suite address located in Boston, Massachusetts. This is one of many companies George Soros funds. In light of the above, it's very apparent that there is a dire need to review the various organizations funded by George Soros. An example of open source politics in action would be George Soros. I mean, like an example of this whole thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to just cut right out of the actual blog, but what I'm getting at here with the piece, and I get excited every time I talk about this, is that open source political theory is it's hard to pin down who's actually organizing these groups. But if we can follow the money, we can really get to the bottom of this. And I really encourage those of you who are journalists and thread junkies. I know that there's some people out there, like this chick on Twitter. Her handle is @somebitchiknow. Her name is like L on Twitter or something like that. But she is super badass when it comes to research, and she spends a lot of time digging into like money and organizational founders. And I really recommend that a lot of journalists get off of this stupid mainstream media train and actually start chasing some stories, you guys, because if we're going to actually do something here, we need to look at the money and figure out where the bottlenecks are and go after these guys in an informational way. We're not going to go out there and beat anybody up. We're not going to go out there with our guns and do any of that stuff. We can do this in a civilized manner. I just think that if we were to spend some time digging into the financing and looking at these 501c3 shell organizations, I mean, they're clearly shell organizations. I'm not some sort of finance expert, but when you go to a philanthropic website and they say that they're a 501c3 doing good stuff for the world, and all you see is no results, no real true plan of action, just kind of blanket statements. And in the case of Mott Philanthropic, they have a one-page website. And they also happen to be somehow connected to a George Soros organization. George Soros, pretty pretty wealthy guy. I think it would be safe to say that if you're doing business with George Soros, you probably have a decent amount of money for him to partner with you, or you either have money or a really good plan. I don't see most business owners just hopping on board with people and not having any understanding of their ability to operate, right? So I think that the 501c3s would be a good place to look. I find it interesting that so many of these 501c3s also receive money from 501c3s that act as fiscal sponsors for other organizations. It almost seems like a giant web of philanthropic 501c3 ventures that are moving money around, and eventually it gets to one of these Black Lives Matter global networks, umbrella organizations, and then it somehow goes, I don't know from where. Where does it go from there? Does anybody know where the money goes once it reaches Black Lives Matter global network? Do we know what they're donating to and what they're buying with their money? And how about George Soros? Where's he getting his money from? Where does his money come from? A philanthropist who donates millions and millions of dollars every year, and nobody knows where his money goes or where it comes from. That's interesting. It almost sounds like something that I've heard before with Jeffrey Epstein, that nobody knew where his money was coming from, and nobody knew where it was going. So might want to look into that. Seems like something that may lead to other articles of investigation. Anyway, I really thank you guys all for watching. Sorry if this is like a cryptic, weird video, but I think that, if you had asked me 10 years ago what I had thought, this is going to sound even more crazy than what I just said. If you'd asked me what I had thought 10 years ago about Alex Jones and what he had said about transhumanism and what he said about globalists, I would have told you that guy is for sure crazy. I kind of agree. I would have probably agreed with his views on health and lowering inflammation in the body and not eating an inflammatory diet and kind of reverting to a more naturalistic diet. I would have agreed with that. But globalism, transhumanism, that's a bunch of junk is what I would have told you 10 years ago. Until last week when I dug into IRS tax statements and ownership records and followed the money. And what did I find? I found a magazine about transhumanism. I found articles describing what is essentially a political movement with no distinguished leadership to prevent people from being pinned in revolutionary action. And I found funding from one of the country's most wealthy individuals, essentially moving through a tier of 501c3 shell organizations that apparently, really, if I'm wrong, please point me in the right direction of where the money is going from these 501c3s and show me what good these companies are doing in the community. Using the money to organize is a effing joke, okay? You can't be a charitable organization just to throw on events, right? You have to be doing something productive in the society to get a tax exempt status. That's what I think anyway. Maybe that's too far up. That's too far ahead of what we have today to not allow people to claim tax exempt status when all they're doing is organizing and educating colleges. So I think we should look into that as journalists. And I thank you all for watching. Please go read The No Man's Zone. Of course, I'll be doing more videos as soon as something else is out. After this article, I have pretty much decided that I would like to expand my work to include what appears to be a giant sex trafficking ring here in the United States. Obviously, we discovered this with the arrest of Epstein and Maxwell, but I think it might be beneficial to dive into the funding of that network and where the money was coming from and how that perhaps plays into other things that are happening in the country today. So I thank you guys for watching. I hope you all have a good day. And if you really enjoy this journalism and you want to support my work, please consider donating $5 on our site. I have a donate button there at the No Man Zone. I bring all of this to you guys free of charge because I believe in freedom of information and I believe in giving power to the people to make their own decisions with real information. So if you enjoy my journalism, please donate like $5 on my site. If you can donate more, that's always appreciated, but $5 is really all that's needed to keep me writing. Thank you guys. Have a good one. Bye.